So welcome to the Steps Collective. I'll just get on and read the words. Show the easy place to start. As we navigate these transitional times, traverse the emerging regenerative territory, we commonly find that there is not always an obvious path to follow. With many questions to navigate, yet no single answer to guide us, we look for the footprints of others to consider where we might take our own first next steps. However, even the most experienced travellers in these spaces would admit they're continually finding their way, unsure of what is around the next bend or over the next peak. This is an ongoing dance with uncertainty, switching between action and inspiration, acting before we think too much and thinking before we go too far. So although taking the first or next step can always feel at the hardest, know that you are not walking alone. Whether or not your own trail will become a valuable path for others doesn't matter. We help each other towards a regenerative tomorrow not as experts, but as parents, neighbours, colleagues, and citizens. With that, Rob, I'd invite you to take over and we'll do the mic switch thing in 3, 2, 1.
Seamless. Absolutely seamless. So welcome. Thank you very much for hosting me. First of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip through some examples and we're going to share the links in the chat. And then I'd really like to open up. We'll try and listen and share from you, our citizens of this group, as many as possible. We will try to get through things. Obviously, it's going to be impossible to listen to everyone's views. So we would love you to also share the examples in the chat as we go. We hope that we find that acceptable. Right, cool, share, boom. Hopefully you can see my screen and you can hear me okay. Right, brilliant. So today I'm representing my dual hat, which is I'm a senior tutor of the Royal College of Art, and I work on the Design Futures programme. I also run the Ecological Citizens Network. Now, it's quite a loaded piece. We'll get to the ecological in a minute. For the purposes of this, we're going to deal with citizens. If you haven't met us before, then there's some links, drop us a line. We can have a look at later at the site and things like that. So I think first of all, kind of like, what do we mean by citizen? And I think this is really contentious and everyone's going to have a completely different view, which is really good. And I think that's something that's really important, is that our position or my position is a position, not the position. And I think it's really important that we start talking about that. We can disagree. That's super good. We will come from different cultures, different backgrounds, really, really critical. But I think how we talk about it's what we do. That for me is the most important thing. I think that's the challenge as soon as you start to unpack that. I think it's about how do you encourage people to engage? How do you encourage people to have positive impacts on people? And I think it is quite a utopian view. I accept that. But I think it's really important that in order to enact this sort of work, you have to do that. And sometimes you have to also look at the negative connotations of how you are creating things so that people are safe. Because I think there is too much reliant on how we're giving people, not considering the positions of where things can go wrong. And then how do we protect against that? And that's a whole other discussion. So I've got a few examples from around the world of working in these spaces that I'm going to share. I shared the links with John in the chat, so he can drop them all in. So please look at these. I don't think there's a perfect example because actually, if I'm honest, the perfect agency, we have to work outside a capitalist system and we have to do so many things. So it's the context of what it is. Skateistan is a beautiful project. It's really, really interesting, mainly because it's providing an educational classroom and platform to bring together, it was specifically created to bring together women from around backgrounds where education was not encouraged. And so it's like, how do you give people the remit of doing something together whilst having an educational bias? Really, really interesting. So within citizen design, it's about giving people a mechanism where people can appropriate, build on, change, evolve, and kind of dictate the terms, be responsible for the governance and how things are working. And so Again, as you can understand, these things get nuanced and really, really tricky. But it's a really good example. It's actually run out of Berlin, and it's now working internationally. So it's kind of a nice tie-in. How can you get people to work together through different pieces? Where we are today, Cafe Dominica, it's a beautiful example. And I think the reason that it's a really interesting example is because it is building social value through a means which is covered by financial value. And that's why it's really interesting. It's safeguarding. You are designing and building people's jobs, but you're doing it within such a way where they are exploring completely different things. And then um, the location around those places are being positively benefited. Why? Because people have new opportunities that they didn't necessarily have before. And I think sometimes when we're talking about citizenship, we're talking about what it means to be accessible as well. So the same way that if you look at the volunteering sector, and everyone will have completely different views on it, the problem is for the time rich. It's not truly accessible to all to have a voice in that. And how do we look at those paradigms? And I think those are really interesting discussions. Um, the Crochet Coral Reef, a really interesting project that was born. It was born out of Miami, and what they were doing is they were looking at the notion of bringing people together to start to understand climate change, but really create these gorgeously constructed, hand crocheted labors that then they would communicate, because they were going, actually, how can we start to look at the work that is involved in it? Now, the challenge with this sort of work is obviously you've got a beautiful aesthetic, you've got certain pieces in how it's working. How do you give people autonomy and then not look over their shoulder and go, don't do it like this, don't do it like that? These are really, really interesting things. And these are mechanisms that we need to let go of, because as soon as you give people permission, actually, you need to let people respond, and they won't always respond how you want them to. And also you need to let that happen. So that's why this type of design is it's really challenging, because you have to take a mid seat and also a back seat so that other people can drive it. An example that catalyzed the ecological citizens, the funding bid that we're currently working on, was My Nature Watch. I'll be honest, we created it as a project that people could build to engage with the natural world. What it is a camera trap that you can build for about 35, 40 quid using a Raspberry Pi. It's completely repairable, deployable, and has since led to loads of impacts around the country, with people taking on holiday, people re-engaging with the natural world, people thinking about things in a different place. And the best decision that happened in the project, so this was a collaborative project with then Goldsmiths in London, was my colleague, Professor Bill Gaver, just went, no, we're not going to call it data. We're going to call it content. We're also going to just let people report on what they see. They're not going to take part in an experiment. The experiment is what happens when we deploy these things. That, to a funder, it was terrifying, because you're like, it went really well. But we really had to sit on our hands to let it go well and kind of seed it, because there were a lot of things that failed. And I think that's something that we need to talk about more, because actually that's an exponential growth. That's how things build. And sometimes trying things and giving other people agency and autonomy is really important. The difference in this example is that this had sustainable intent. Okay. So whereas the previous examples were about citizen design and how you're enabling other people to do things, the intention of the project was about how can we enable sustainable intent. And I think that's a big difference. When we're looking at regenerative and we're looking at citizens, I find it easier to separate the two and go, how do you give people autonomy over things? And then how do you do it for regeneration? Because it's great to combine them, brilliant, but sometimes you can't do all of that at once, because it becomes really, really tricky. A beautiful project, if you have time to check it out, the Sheffield Wheat Experiment. So Ruth Levine is a brilliant artist that I've been lucky enough to interview a few times. The Sheffield wheat experiment is, so if you're that familiar with Monsanto and their processes and their kind of, well, no, we're being recorded, evilness. Um, one thing they don't encourage is heritage grain. So the idea of heritage grain is that you can reclaim the seeds from any stock that you're growing, and then plant it again. So Monsanto, they intensify this, so that you have to use their pesticides, you have to regulate it. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really not great. The Sheffield wheat experiment is all about how to preserve heritage grain. And so the beautiful thing about this project was that it wasn't about yield. It was about how do you enable people to grow wherever they are to regenerate that space. And they did it in such a way that it was people growing on their window boxes, growing outside the front of their garden. Again, they're regenerating that space, they're providing things, but it's difficult. Incredible Edible, another kind of perfect organic example of a project that started just with the simple values of actually our human rights. Food is a human right. How do we get value to that? How do we enable that? Which starts to look at governance, which starts to look at actually how do we look at land ownership? How do we look at these different spaces? Again, it's really not easy. This is a project actually that's come out of Ecological Citizens, and it's an interesting tie because it's basically using waste material products from farms to then look at how we can build housing insulation. Okay, so it's a really simple thinking about a farm as a factory. Brilliant. The most important thing that the team that are running it, Local Work Studio, that they are kind of forcing everything towards, which is brilliant, is actually the farm workers. That's what the project is about. How do you build the onus in their citizenship and materiality, and what can that be? And what are their rights within that? Which is a really, really interesting take. It's not about mass commercialization. Resting reef. So a couple of my students and some colleagues, students, a while ago started looking at death. And it was a really interesting start point in their project because they had a personal experience. Unfortunately, one of their parents had died. And so they started to go, it's kind of crazy. And it is crazy in the UK that we take really interesting sites. We put somebody, and again, please, you're allowed to disagree with me. And I know why we do it. But then you put someone in a piece of land that we can't use for anything else. And then we don't have space. And so in Venice, they have, cemetery islands, which is bonkers, right? So it's a really beautiful project that's starting to go, actually, if we, at people's end of life, how do we enable them to become a reef and to give back to that society and that space and that ecosystem that lives around? And it's a work in progress. It's a really beautiful project. And again, it's why these things become challenging, because actually what they should also be looking at is what happens when people need to remove these in 10 years' time. Where does that go? How does that sit? So again, these examples, they are very contextual, they are place-based, and they're really nuanced. And I'm giving a mega quick overview of them just to kind of open up these spaces. This is a project. So I'm often quite skeptical about AI. Everyone has their own view of it. This is probably the best example. Unfortunately, Space 10 no longer exists. It's a really good experimentation of how AI could be used and the potential. And what it was is basically because Space 10 is what it was, a studio that was commissioned to work within IKEA to basically be their prototyping design lab, kind of build things that could be a benefit to IKEA and how that would work. And so they started to look at plates because IKEA likes plates. And they started to go, right, okay, well, if we were to produce plates from particular places, what would they look like and what would they be using their local material streams? And it's a really interesting, pragmatic view of then actually, how do you enable certain materials to be prioritized in certain spaces? How do you enable citizens to have more choice? It's probably one of the only interesting pieces of AI that I've seen to date that I go, actually, that's quite pragmatic. I'm skimming through these really quickly. I'm aware of it. It's just for contextualization. This is quite an academic project, and it raises quite a few ethical challenges as well. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but the Turtle Project out of Queen Mary. Um, so people, or traditionally within the context of this place, would steal turtle eggs for value for restaurant markets. And so what the researchers did under their ethics scheme within their institution was started to create IoT fake eggs so that they could trace where the criminals were and start to uncover criminal rings. Um, yeah, I'm still, it's kind of, it's great. The ethics start to come to this. Is that good? Is that bad? But I think we have to bear in mind that actually what you're opening up is things can be used against you, and how does that work, and what's our relationship with it? So it's a really good counterpoint. And I know it was run by a project run by Queen Mary, and it was done within a lot of ethics consultation of their institution. Some of the last projects that I show, I think the more we talk about technology, we actually have to talk about appropriate technologies. Because appropriate is contextual to different places. And this is a really interesting project called High Water Line. So Eve Mosher is an artist. They live in Scotland, and they were touring different places, and they started to go, actually, in 5 years' time, this is where, due to climate change, this is where the water level is going to be. And it actually really opened up the conversation and the dialogue of those different communities, because they would just go into judicial buildings and go, look, this is where this is going to be. They brought in MPs, they brought in people, it allowed people to have a voice that was then supported. Again, how much citizen autonomy is in this? Probably less. I don't think you're always going to get that perfect. Okay. It's the same with open design or a wiki or all of those spaces. How much autonomy do people have? I think that's something that we need to question. Because the more autonomy people have, quite often, the more expensive it is, or the more costly to implement, or kind of who's not at the table. And so these are all trade-offs, the same way that you think about any design projects. And I'm very conscious that I've chosen design or arts-led projects. Okay. My favorite as an appropriate technology, if you ever go to Suffolk, a crinkle crankle wall. So what this is this wall uses less bricks than conventional walls, because conventional walls, straight walls, have buttresses, okay, every 5-6 meters. This doesn't need that, so it uses less bricks. It requires more skill to be able to lay it, but also it was a Victorian technology, and the idea is that you could plant dwarf fruit stocks in the culverts of these waves, because if it was south facing, it would retain the heat and then enhance the growth of that tree. So when we start to talk about, citizen, we're kind of talking about what the skills it takes to be able to put these things together, which I think is really important. And as soon as we talk about appropriate technologies, we can open up that conversation, that we're not just talking about, high tech IoT. Actually, we're talking about the ways in which things are passed on, the gateways in which and how we open things up so that people can appropriate them. And I think that's going to be so contextual and so place-based. Yeah, it's kind of untrue. So this is some of the things that we on the EC project kind of stand from within our definitions of kind of like what we're looking at within design for citizens, which is non-extractive, designed with, not for, intent on catalyzing autonomy. I'd say that's probably the hardest thing, because you're creating systems where then people can build off the back of them. Sometimes it can be expensive. I think contextually appropriate is absolutely critical for all of this type of work. But also, I think so's changing or shifting the environment where it's always been about scale. Okay, it's not. It doesn't. Things can be for 5 people. Things can be for 1,000 people. But that's deciding what that metric is really critical. So here we're going to open the floor, and it might be little bit bonkers if people could put their hand up and go, right, I want to share. There's no obligation to. You can just share it in the chat and we can pull it up. But it will be lovely. I think all of the examples that I've shown, like I said, are a example. They're not the example. I don't think there is a perfect. My agenda or suggestion here was if we can share as many of these examples, you can go, how would I do that but as this? How could I take that but as this? Actually, if I was to think about Team Dominica and then I was looking at rewilding, how would that work? And so that we can grow collectively. And if you disagree with me, brilliant. I welcome that because I don't think I'm right. And just to say, so I don't have to pull these up again. If you want to reach out to us to talk about anything else, screenshot, drop us an email. And
You send around these slides as well, like
absolutely.
excellent. You send these around.
So yeah, stop share. If you have an example, I'm just gonna look in the chat. Thank you, John. If you've got one example that comes to mind, or there's something, a piece that you want to discuss, I know it's like the first person's always like, but I would love, you are citizens of this call. And I'd love you to be able to go, this is what works in our place, or even if it's a web link or a narrative or just comments, I think is really good. And I think I always lean towards the utopian because we want stuff to work. It's also really good when there's stuff that hasn't worked so that we can learn from it. Like, I love it when researchers go, I've just published a paper on how you should not do this. Brilliant. Is really good. I think that's really positive. Any hands? Charlie, get it. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry. I'm in a noisy cafe, so I don't know if this is going to be too annoying. But basically, the project I just shared is called Centropole Volant. It meals Centropole on wheels. And it's like Meals on Wheels from the US. But what they do is they have the community work together to do rooftop beekeeping, growing urban and community gardens, which are quite popular in Montreal in general. And I think Quebec's culture, compared to the rest of North America, has some of those like more values. And it's just kind of an odd, isolated place. So these guys have a cafe. They kind of grow their own bread. They do workshops and all this stuff. And ultimately, they have a service where they end up delivering meals on wheels, like in the US, to people who cannot maybe afford high quality organic food. So yeah, just wanted to share that. If anyone's interested, the website has a lot more details on all their work. So that's one thing from North America.
It's Charlie. Awesome. Anybody else? I really want your voices to be heard, Roland. Janine.
Hi. Yeah, I've just shared a project that I do some volunteering with. And it's just a farm who just decided to open up their land to anyone who wanted land and created a space. And it often attracts people who haven't always, fitted in well with the rest of society. And they're creating these incredible organic agroforestry land-based projects. And then they're called community enterprises. And I just volunteer and mentor them. And they're just amazing human beings. And it's just the land, the rules are that it's agroforestry and it's organic. And it's very much connected with community. And if you have an idea, you can turn up and you can either volunteer there or ask to have some land. And I just love that total, like, break the rules. Why not?
Ooh. I have questions. I hope I'll shout into Rob's mic. So this is super. Do you know of So a lot of people turned out to volunteer, but then just after, you always like, do you graduate through? Do you sort of like you volunteer in someone else's, then you go, oh, this has given me an idea that maybe I want to do a thing as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it attracts people who are looking for a space, and I know at least one of them has transferred into that situation. But there's a surprising amount of people on a circuit looking for land in the world, and I think that's what's really interesting. And they used either the woofing system or just volunteer system to try out a community. And it just heartens me to know that there's more people than we realize out there offering space for things like this. So yeah, occasionally, yeah.
Mm. Who's next? Thank you. Any other things? Please chip in.
Savita.
Savita.
Hi there. It's my first Steps Collective. Great to be here. So just the idea that came to mind, and just thinking about something that didn't work as well. So Noel Constitutional Club it's a bar, it's a venue here in Bristol. It was completely taken over by a bunch of volunteers who then kind of refurbished it, and now there's everything from like wine nights to snooker nights to and there's all kinds of social regeneration happening and work with local suppliers. But something that didn't work was that the kind of governance committee, who's made up completely of volunteers, decided to get a bit of money together and have a paid volunteer coordinator to try to kind of bring people together. And it didn't work, because actually what worked was sort of a little bit messier, everyone sort of working together rather than kind of elevating one person to be the paid coordinator. So actually messy was better in this scenario. And if you're ever in Bristol, I'll take you there for a drink.
Sounds awesome. I mean, I think it's an interesting, the governance structure, I think I know from my experience, is something that is always challenging, like how making decisions. One beautiful example is Detroit Soup. If you're not familiar with it, I've just put it in the chat. It's brilliant. It's like a crowdfunding network and scheme and process where you pay $5, a couple of bucks on the door, you go in, you have a bowl of soup, you then get an evening of dance, comedy, theatrics, whatever, and then 3 pitches, and you vote on one pitch, and then basically the people that win get the door money to go and do that project. Then 3 months later, they come and tell you about it. It's a really interesting place-based opportunity. There's burst out and created quite a lot of CICs. It's a really beautiful thing. Again, it started out of Detroit for a reason, because they were in real trouble. But it's an interesting model, but it takes a critical mass of people to pull these things together. And I think that's the challenge that I have sometimes with this work, is that it should be accessible to all, not just the time rich or the rich. And I think how we do that and how we cross cultural barriers is really important.
Nina.
Hi. So I grew up in Singapore, and we don't have access to a lot of public spaces, which means you need to like go into government owned spaces to garden or whatever. So Gardens by the Bay is like a popular tourist attraction. We've got a lot of fake trees in the sky. But below that is a lot of protected species, which means a lot of citizens can just go in and be citizen horticulturists. It's really cool because my grandparents used to do it too. My parents used to do it. And we, the kids, used to go and do it. So you can actually like name it. You can grow your own tree. You can even grow herbs, which are local. What we should understand is it's a very tropical country, which means every afternoon at 2, it's probably raining. So you would see like tourists bunch there and then horticulturists just working. Training's done, and yeah, they can keep doing it, and then they can go back to the botanical gardens and get training and all that.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important to have all these elements within the mix. And I think, like, I would how to avoid catalyzation without colonialism. I think, like, what's that balance of like, hey, we want this. That's something I think we should be transparent about and just chat about and go, hey, look, we've got funding to do this. How does that work? A project I put in there again is open structures. I would say it's kind of a parts repository so that people can build lots of different things. It requires a certain skill level, and again, it adds complexity. So people can essentially make, repair, build their own things, design their own parts, bring things together, but it requires a certain skill level to be able to opt in. And I think these things, again, that's where it breeds complexity, and that's where it goes, what skill levels should or shouldn't, and how access do you have? Yeah, interesting conversation to have.
Kyle, this is like a radio show, so like Kyle, you're meant to come on now, Kyle, and go say, "Hi, long-term listener, first thing, please." Kyle.
Hello, hello. I'm on my phone. I'll see if I could switch to a laptop, but I've run out of time. So here you go. Hey Rob, thank you so much for this session. It's like so lovely to hear all these stories on a Friday. But yeah, I think I was racking my brains for these things because it feels like immediately like Civic Square would pop up as kind of a really good example of this. But I feel many people will know about that, but I can dive into it if people are coming to that for the first time. But the link I put into the chat is the People Act. So this is Katie Rubin's stuff around legislative theatre, which has always like captured my imagination because I feel like this intersection like citizens, policy, and theatre is a really interesting sort of like weird thing to hear about immediately, but when you see it play out, it's really, really powerful. And so the idea is that you work with citizens to put on a performance, demonstrate a power dynamic that's happening in the local community, and then bring policymakers to watch that theatrical performance and then iterate on ways to improve how that's playing out to sort of reduce that power dynamic into the future. And it's been used to sort of, I think in Manchester, to sort of develop new policies to support women walking home at night and things like that. And so I think it bridges that idea that policy is something that's dealt with by people and somewhere else to citizens actually being active participants there. So I think there's so much stuff to dive into in that. It still feels quite niche at the moment, but I think there's a few opportunities coming from that. But that website launched early this year, I think. So it's definitely worth checking out.
Thank you.
Yeah, right to you.
And Ania. Hey, welcome.
Hi, thank you. I will lower my hand because otherwise I will forget. I think it's just so I work for Locomotion, which is a place-based program, and I am a coordinator, but I can see how difficult the role is. Well, at the moment we're trying to share the power a little bit more equally. And it is also a challenge. And I was really inspired by what you said about the time reach and time poor. And I'm just wondering, and the governance, I think this is what every place-based program will struggle with. We really easily go back to old governance structures. And it's so tempting, even if you want to create something very new, we just slide into what we know and what feels safe. So I'm curious about the time reach and time poor. Are there any good examples how we can actually engage with people who don't have time to be engaged, and how we can give them power so they really feel a part of the movement? Yeah, because this is our challenge as well.
Totally. I think so I do quite a lot of work with the UKRI, so the UK's Research and Innovation Unit, and one of the hardest things is going, actually, we need to pay participants for their participation, otherwise they can't be included in research studies and how this works. And that's one of the hardest things to do in an institution. So how we're working to do that, I think you have to give that agency. I think I suppose it comes back to the EDI of kind of like, it's not just who you include, but how you include them and how you ensure that expectation is really clear. So you can go, hey, look, this is what we can do, and this is where your decision's coming. So like we have on Ecological Citizens, one thing we do is we name all, obviously we get consent, we go through GDPR, everything within our studies, but also we email them any papers that have come out of workshops to go, this is what you were a part of, and this is how this is happening. And it's really critical because actually without our combined effort. And so little things like how the terms of how we're calling people peer researchers, because that's what they are, they're peer researchers. So how are we working together? And I think those perfect systems, we've got a couple of things that we're working on in kind of schemes. I mean, permissioning the city is quite an interesting one, but kind of how we're looking at that governance and how we're looking kind of building those things over time and looking at volunteering. I'm doing some work with Ealing Borough Council to look at just that. Like, how do you enable everybody to have a voice who might be able to... So it's an ongoing conversation. I don't think there's a perfect. There might be a perfect in a different place. But I don't think there's a perfect yet in the UK. National Park Cities is doing some pretty cool stuff, but again, it's volunteering. And so where does it sit? And I think, again, with Savita, thank you for raising those points of how do you create a different dynamic when you pay somebody within a volunteering organization? Like, that changes stuff. So how do you do that carefully? So nuanced, but it needs to be handled appropriately. You know, most of this volunteering work is handled on WhatsApp, which eats into people's time or their families or their... So how do we have a perfect platform? And so that's where I don't think the people, the organizations releasing people for a certain amount of days to volunteer is enough. I think it's about how do you build a long-term link. That's what's really important. Savita.
I just put a provocation in the chat about binning the word volunteering. I mean, I think, like, as a charity, whenever we talk about volunteers, suddenly you need like a role and you need like guidance. You know, there's a whole kind of thing, and that is appropriate sometimes, but it sort of decides ahead of time how someone will take part, which just seems the opposite of what we're talking about right now. And we just use those words really interchangeably. So
Yeah, agreed. I think it's really important. You know, we think about how we're naming everything. I'm just seeing Jenny. Thank you for making your beautiful contribution. Was it your lost cat?
Sadly, no. I just Googled it because I was thinking about it. Although I did just see, to John's point in the chat, a lamppost which had a big round sticker on it that just said "Fuck you, Brighton Council," and it didn't have any indication as to what that referred to or why. It was just, it was interesting. But that sort of sense of
Everything all the time, apparently. Everything.
oh, I can't hear you. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I think, but these things, these points of interaction as well are really, really critical, because as soon as you start to go, actually, everyone's going to do that and they're going to have an app. It's like, right, great. Well, how do they do that? Can they even be bothered by it? It's like, it's just extra noise. And so what does that support look like? What are people's roles? I'm aware that it's brilliant. It's been so noisy. Is there anyone else that wanted to contribute who's felt that they haven't been able to yet? Please, just a reminder, stick your hand up. We'd love to hear from you. If not, I'll rattle through a couple of examples.
3, 2, 1. Switch the noise. So I just drew a diagram out because I studied economics and that's what I do. But to Ania's point, on time rich and time poor and so on. So I started thinking back to this diagram. So let some people have loads and loads of time, but very few. Lots of people have very little amount of time. And so there's almost like within any community, you're thinking about, okay, so what's the distribution? Who's got lots of time? And sometimes you find yourself up there and you go, I am the person that's got the most time for this. And I feel kind of like exposed for it because you go, but I'm doing all the work. And you just go, no, but collectively, there's no point in just being one person there. You need the kind of distribution of all these people underneath it will come together and do a thing. So it's like all of these requirements and sort of like the time rich and time poor kind of let you go, we almost have to use it. Have to think of it as a whole collective, and you go sort of like, who has got the time for this and how can I support others no matter how much or how little time they have within that. Do I do a mic switch? 3, 2, 1.
Micha.
This has reminded me of something that I guess is an example of this, but I hadn't thought of it just until now. So 8 of us in my town are doing a gardening project together because the person who owns the garden felt it was too overwhelming to do anything with it because it's too much space and they don't have the time. and they don't have the skills, but the rest of us have either time or skills or resources that we can contribute, and everyone drops in when and how they can. And at this point, it's kind of like started to evolve and grow into something that other people bring things into. So we're fostering a wormery because someone's worms got kicked out by their landlord because they didn't want worms on the property. And it's now in our garden. And it's just like someone else donated tons of compost because they bought too much. And it's just like all started to come together, but it's small bits from different people that are just coming together and nobody really owns it. There's no leadership as such, apart from the person who obviously owns the garden, but they don't have the skills to do anything with it.
Totally. I think this is it's kind of the challenge, which is how do these organizations exist, run, operate so that it's accessible, but also so that people can leave them. And I think that's sometimes like, how do you, it's kind of, we need new ways of designing, and I'm going to quote unquote, businesses, entities, CICs, where the knowledge stays within the organization so that it can just keep growing. And that's not necessarily how we design businesses. So the problem is that kind of everything's kind of broken. And so you need to start going, actually, which bits can we borrow from? And then how do we include these? I've got another example, unless somebody else wanted to put their hand up. I'll keep going. So, a bit something from Pins, something from Catherine. Something going. I think, Anir, you raised a comment, and then there's the kind of the different influence. I think absolutely. I think sometimes also that comes with privilege. It also comes, and it's so contextual and cultural. And so it's like when I've worked in India, I've had a real challenge with the fact that I've worked within such a class system, and actually all of those people, they're like, "Oh, this is a brilliant idea," and all we did was went, you need to listen to the people you're working with, not me. And that's a challenge. So how we use that privilege as well within a place and enable other citizens to build, I think, is really critical. And it's not always easy. One example. Oh, yes, totally. Carl, very good comment. Vertical University, visited them about a year ago. Really interesting project where they were. So it's in Nepal, and what they were doing is they realised that education essentially, as a process, can bring funding and regeneration. So rather than people within hillside communities leaving to go and get better jobs in cities, they stayed within that region because then they could train towards qualifications, but also they had an extra income sources that they could teach. So you're building an infrastructure. And I think we're going on a tangent here, but how we design for exit within what I would call post-participatory design is probably one of the first things you have to do. Like, how are you going to leave so that there is autonomy in how people are using things? Because then you can design from then on there.
I'm going to come on with something in a bit, but go to Pins, then go to Catherine. Pins.
Hi, John, and everyone else. I just put something in the chat, which is a neighbour had told me about years ago, which is a matching scheme. So it's building on what Misha was saying. I think it's only in the UK and a couple of other places as a map on the site. And there is a financial contribution to keep it running. But it does exactly what you're saying, Misha, but on a much bigger scale. And it matches people who can't tend their gardens with people who want to tend a garden, basically. I'll just put the link in the chat. Something else that occurred to me is there's a platform for grateful, but I don't know if it's actually citizen led. But I'll stick it in the chat. People can make of it what they will, and that's based in it's again in the UK. I'm afraid for everyone else, but it's a website and a platform for doing cooking classes. Again, it's paid, but to generate income for typically migrant women, but not exclusively women in the UK. And so other people can purchase cooking classes. and other, organizations can pay to buy classes, and the money gets circulated. I will again put a link in the chat.
Just as a note, I'm collecting and copy and pasting these so that we can have them and share them with the slides, because I think they're really, really important. Any others? Fiona? Sorry, Catherine.
Thanks. No, not much to add. I think firstly, just to say thank you for everyone sharing and speaking through all of these examples. It's really energizing. I think just a couple of things that have been shared have been reminded me of sort of models of mutual aid, if it's something folks are familiar with, and there's quite a helpful book by Dean Spade I'd recommend. So just linked that in the chat.
So I'm just going to throw in a funny little story if you don't mind, because it's about cultural connection and stuff. So I remember being on a train in India where there's this old guy sitting opposite me, and we so connected. I think I bought him a tea. You get these little thimble cups, plastic cups of tea, and so we drank this tea, and we didn't have any language going on at all. It was just literally just sort of drinking this tea. And then he opened the window on the train, and basically was inviting me to throw my cup out the window. And he threw his cup out the window. And the question was, what do I do, right? And actually, it's a really good, in India, there's no system whereby you go and put it in a bin and it ends up being picked up by someone and taken to a landfill. It just doesn't happen. So actually, the practical thing from his point of view to do is to throw out the window, right? Because it's just as good as anything else, and it'll end up getting on a pile where you get kids crawling across it and taking little bits of plastic. But it's just really, I've never forgotten that sort of moment when you're really confronted by your own sort of perceptions of what is right in terms of doing stuff, and his perception is just completely different. And actually, I wanted to connect with him, so that was what I tried to do, was try and connect with him. And actually, he'd probably think it was a bit odd if I didn't throw my cup out the window, him having opened the window. Anyway,
Totally. I think the social acceptance of different spaces, and I think it's also the danger of this sort of work. The lens that we bring is both brilliant and also a challenge, and sometimes it's about enabling another culture just to go, what's this to you? Amazing. Because I've been in many situations where, again, it's kind of a blessing and a curse of kind of how you're sitting these things. I'm just seeing
Esther's got a hand up.
Try to be, quick. I've been sitting on whether or not to say something, but I'm a question I'm curious on. Is this idea of citizens or volunteers or stewards creating spaces for a community, but the people who maybe show up into that space who aren't citizens or volunteers don't want to necessarily be an active player in creating it, but really need to benefit from it. Maybe it's a neighborhood, I've been sitting a lot and thinking a lot about libraries, which of course are public institutions and public spaces, but are being very much crafted by communities around them, and who many people come to who are not interested in the books, but are interested in the shelter, or interested in the moments of connection that they have. And so, I liked this provocation that you started with of like, how do we define citizenship, and how it then got tangled into volunteerism and stewardism and all of this. And then the kind of question and provocation I'm sitting with moving forward is, if we separate these two, right? If there are the volunteers of the community of the project, then what does that make everyone else who is participating or a part of it? Are they then citizens? If you're not performing citizenship, do you get to have that title? So something interesting that I don't have an answer to, but I'm curious.
This has really spoke to me because I'd noted something down, Esther, which is kind of like, I think this is in a very similar space, but there's a part of Lou Down and Sarah Drummond's work with the School of Good Services talks about 80% of design being to make the space for good design to happen. Not the actual design, just making the space for it. I wonder if this is and I just noted it down there back to Rob's definition, creating the space for citizenship to be claimed, enacted, and performed. So there is something about some people don't know how, don't have the resource in order for that space to be created, but they would like to claim, enact, and perform citizenship. But there's just a kind of this other role, and it's all, after me, I'd invite Hardeep just to talk about when she's talking about stewardship versus volunteering.Maybe the sort of the stewarding is sort of like, I'm here to create the space for citizenship, but it's not just me in creating the space as a citizen. Anyone who is here to claim, enact, and perform the thing within the space, you are a citizen too. I'm going to throw that ball to Hardeep, and then to Fiona. If she's still here. Right, to Fiona.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to catch that ball, John, but I will. I think the point I was going to make was brief about this idea of stewardship. And like my first role was for an art gallery in Minnesota where it was sold by Pillsbury for $1 to the artists. So we sandblasted it and made it into an art gallery. And then what I did, which was my first kind of management role, was to essentially build like a bartering system within the gallery. So then we, based on kind of the investment of people in the space and what I figured out long before as a user researcher, what was in it for them, like why were they there, what did they want to get out of this. And so we then had almost like a proto Patreon model where essentially, like, based on what they brought to the space in terms of time and contribution to the exhibitions, they got back. So they got studio spaces, or they got like access to the tools, or we created this model, and it went really well for like multiple years. And then I was able to actually attach a cost to that model in terms of the contributions the volunteers were bringing. So then I was able to argue for increased money to support those programs and to support those spaces. So that's always been like the template that I've tried to take forward with me in terms of like organizing, because we had nothing and there were so many people who literally had nothing, who were coming as artists and needed space, but also needed that mentorship and camaraderie. But it always comes back to, for me, physical space, because digital spaces just don't do this in the right way. And people can't own it.
Yeah, it's a challenge in our work that we found, is how it's like just being somewhere.
Age next. I think she said
Yeah.
she's here.
Great. Sorry, yeah, I can unmute myself. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. So just this idea of stewardship, and I think Johnny just touched upon it, this idea of not having a central role, right? This idea of like a flat structure. And so actually what you're there for is a role of tending, of caretaking, of enabling. And so this idea is that, can you be attentive to the needs that are spoken and unspoken in a given space or a given project or a container, where it's not really about ownership of that, but the facilitation and enabling. And so stewardship again is about sometimes being the one who's there just to make sure things are discreetly going well as overtly, right? And so yes, this analogy of tending to something I think is really meaningful, and especially in physical spaces I find that really intriguing, because you do need a bit like a composer. It's like someone who is just there for the sake of the group, for things to actually emerge. And again, there's a bit of serendipity that can go on, but not taking ownership of the outcome, but some sense of responsibility that you want whatever thing it is to flourish as much as possible. So that's where I think it's less about ownership of the outcome, but a sense of care and tending to the process as you go along. And I think that's what stewardship allows. And the idea of volunteering, as some of the comments had mentioned, it's like you're having to sacrifice some of your own time or autonomy to be in a given place, where stewardship, I mean, I'm a bit biased because I love that term, but it's more empowering. It's more about a contribution. And there's no sense of hierarchy that I have to give to you because you are in need of something. It's that we're there to tend to something together to improve it collectively. So that's what I would say in terms of the dynamics of using certain words.
It's 2 o'clock. I do want to mention one thing before we go. Light switch. So I mentioned this in the chat, and I'm just very aware that there's a Sussex subset to Steps Collective. We're sitting here in Sussex. There's at least another 4 people on here. I bumped into something about 36 hours ago. After a conversation with John Alexander about charters and the Sussex Charter. And there's there's a Sussex Charter which seems to have been written when someone called Ian Steedman in Worthing decided there should be a Sussex Day, lobbied a local MP, and now there's a Sussex Day, and it's the 16th of June. We won't be druv, Jenny. Yes, we won't be druv. If anyone is interested in playing around with the Sussex Charter and what it might mean as a piece of citizenship to enable sort of like claiming, enacting, and performing citizenship for and I think Jenny raised this point in the chat for who gets to decide what happens in Sussex. Well, the Sussex people do. Then I'm gonna set something up. I don't know what it is, but I'm just throwing a Sussex flair up in the world there, if anybody is interested in that. Rob, I'm going to hand to you to.
So thank you very much for your time, your suggestions, and all of the things that you've shared. I'll collate these and then share back. I think it's one of these things that we need to constantly reflect on, is that we together know different ways to do this. And the ways that I've shown, the projects that I've shown, and what we're working on in Ecological Citizens is a way to do it. And I think it's really important that we learn how to let go. And please don't tell my wife I said that. It's like, because she'll be like, "What you don't do?" We need to get comfortable with kind of people appropriating concepts, and we need to get comfortable with how we provide access and how we exit projects before we start them, and how we manage expectations of clear roles, and how we nurture, because that's how you create intergenerational learning and so many other things. And also, next time you talk to your bosses, this work, I believe, is the hardest work to do. It's not about technological, it's about people. It's really difficult. So kind of like, don't even start it unless you're going to try and do it and move it forwards, because it's really difficult. But they need to know that. So that's why you don't see the best examples in the world, because it's really challenging. So please reach out to us and please talk to us, because we'd love to build some of this. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time.